Madrid's Midnight Rescue. It began with a phone call that cut through the quiet of a late Spanish evening, a message so urgent that ministers abandoned their dinners, bankers left their gatherings, and lights across official buildings flickered on all at once. Something was deeply wrong inside one of Spain's most venerable financial institutions. By the time the city stirred the next morning, the crisis had already accelerated beyond anything Madrid had faced in decades. To understand how a single night reshaped the fate of Spain's banking system, we must step into a period defined by ambition and vulnerability. The nation had been rebuilding, modernizing, investing in new industries and infrastructure. Banks fueled that ambition with aggressive lending, convinced that growth alone could outpace risk. For a time, the optimism felt justified. Projects rose across the country. Foreign investors returned. Confidence swelled. But beneath this momentum, warning signs flickered. Some regional lenders expanded too quickly. Real estate developers borrowed more than markets could sustain. Oversight committees raised concerns that vanished into political noise. And as Spain pushed forward, its financial institutions became ever more entangled with ventures that depended on perfect conditions that rarely endure. The story begins with a bank that symbolized national progress. Its advertisements filled airports. Its branches dominated city streets. Its leaders spoke proudly of innovation and expansion. Yet behind the facade, liquidity grew thin. Loans accumulated with alarming speed. And internal reports, quietly circulated, rarely acknowledged, hinted that the institution's foundation was far less stable than the public believed. Late one night, those hidden tensions finally broke the surface. A sudden wave of withdrawals by corporate clients triggered alarms deep inside the bank's internal systems. Reserves plummeted. Electronic dashboards flashed warnings. Calls were made, first to executives, then to regulators, and finally to government officials who grasped immediately what was at stake. If the bank failed, it could drag the entire financial system into turmoil. While Madrid slept, a frantic rescue effort began. Ministers gathered around conference tables. Advisors ran projections. Central bank officials weighed the cost of intervention against the cost of collapse. It was a calculation no one expected to confront that night, yet every passing second made the decision more urgent. And beneath the surface of those hurried discussions lay a truth Spain had long tried to avoid: the risks that had been building for years had finally come due. The crisis was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in real time, and the window to save the system was narrowing with every moment. Inside Madrid's central bank, the urgency intensified as fresh data poured in. Reserves at the troubled institution were falling faster than predicted. Overnight transfers showed patterns that pointed not to routine activity, but to fear among insiders, partners, and institutional clients who sensed instability before the public ever would. A quiet run had begun, the kind that unfolds not in crowded lobbies but in digital ledgers, invisible to anyone not watching closely. Officials moved quickly. A crisis team was assembled, blending regulators, economists, and representatives from the finance ministry. Their task was simple in theory yet impossible in practice: stop a collapse without revealing how close the nation stood to disaster. Every discussion carried the same tension: how much support to offer, how quickly to act, and how to prevent word of the crisis from spreading beyond the room. Spain had endured financial turmoil before. It could not afford another shock. Inside the troubled bank, the atmosphere was frantic. Executives huddled in glass-walled offices, reviewing balance sheets that had shifted from concerning to catastrophic in a matter of hours. Lines of credit were expiring. Securities pledged as collateral were losing value. And interbank partners, once eager to lend, had begun tightening their terms or withdrawing entirely. The institution's lifelines were disappearing one by one. Some leaders insisted the crisis could be managed privately. They argued that a public bailout would spark panic across the sector, triggering scrutiny of other lenders with similar vulnerabilities. Others countered that the time for quiet solutions had passed. Without immediate intervention, the bank would fail by morning, and once the first domino fell, countless others could follow. Each option risked igniting the very fear they sought to contain. Meanwhile, international markets began reacting to small but telling clues. A sudden spike in Spanish bond yields. A dip in the value of the major banking index. Analysts abroad spotted the patterns and speculated that a significant institution was in trouble. Their conjectures, though lacking detail, added pressure to Madrid's already strained decision-makers. Back in the crisis room, projections grew darker. The model showed a narrowing path. Without a substantial infusion of liquidity, the bank would default on key obligations before sunrise. The consequences would spread instantly: credit lines frozen, small businesses unable to meet payroll, foreign lenders pulling back. Spain's fragile recovery could unravel in a single day. And then came the revelation that shifted the mood from urgency to alarm. Internal auditors discovered that several of the bank's largest assets were wildly overvalued, their market prices far below what had been reported in official statements. This was not merely a liquidity problem. It was a solvency crisis, one that could not be solved with temporary loans or reassuring words. As the night deepened, ministers realized the truth: they were no longer trying to save just one institution. They were trying to save the entire financial architecture built around it. The rescue would have to be bold, decisive, and immediate. Anything less risked letting the crisis slip beyond their grasp. Spain stood on the edge of a precipice, and the decisions made before dawn would determine whether the nation stepped back or slipped into freefall. The night pressed on, and Madrid felt suspended between calm and catastrophe. Inside the crisis room, the atmosphere thickened as new information revealed just how deeply the bank's troubles had spread. What began as a liquidity shortage now showed the unmistakable signature of a system buckling under years of unchecked risk. Several major loans, once touted as pillars of growth, were exposed as barely recoverable. Entire portfolios had been padded with assumptions rather than assets. The numbers no longer whispered concern, they shouted collapse. As these revelations surfaced, arguments flared among officials who understood the stakes all too well. Some insisted that the bank must be allowed to fall, that supporting it would reward recklessness and strain public finances beyond reason. Others countered with a harsh reality: a failure of this magnitude would ricochet through every corner of the economy. Small lenders depended on this institution for liquidity. Regional businesses depended on it for payroll. Thousands of households depended on it for mortgages. Letting it fail meant letting the country fracture. Meanwhile, markets across Europe stirred. Traders in Frankfurt, Paris, and London noticed unusual movements in Spanish financial instruments. Social media hinted at a mystery bank under stress. The anonymity did little to calm nerves. The world knew Spain was wrestling with something big, something that could reshape more than its domestic banking landscape. Even before dawn, the crisis had already outgrown its borders. Inside the troubled bank's headquarters, employees worked with a grim determination. Some attempted to reconcile accounts that refused to balance. Others fielded calls from partners demanding assurances they could no longer give. A few senior executives, pale and exhausted, confronted the realization that their institution's reputation, built over decades, had been eroded in a single night. Pride was replaced by dread. Optimism had given way to accountability. Back in the government's command center, the central bank governor laid out a painful truth: without intervention, the institution would be insolvent within hours. Reserves were nearly gone. Market confidence had evaporated. And the interconnected nature of Spain's financial sector meant the crisis would not remain isolated. Contagion was not a risk, it was a guarantee. The room fell into a heavy silence as leaders contemplated their next move. They reviewed every scenario, each more dangerous than the last. Bailouts carried political consequences. Nationalization invited scrutiny and long-term financial burdens. Allowing collapse threatened social unrest. There was no perfect choice, only the least catastrophic. As the clock ticked toward dawn, the final blow arrived. An international lender, one the bank depended on for overnight funding, refused to roll over a significant position. The message was blunt: without proof of stability, there would be no further support. The refusal widened a financial void already too large. The crisis, once creeping, now stood in the doorway. Realizing that the window for prevention was seconds from closing, the crisis team reached unanimous agreement. Action could no longer wait for daylight.
The bank would be seized, stabilized, and restructured before markets opened.
It was an extraordinary measure, one reserved only for moments when an entire economy hovered at the edge of collapse. As preparations began for the government's intervention, the city remained unaware of the drama unfolding behind illuminated windows. But for those in the room, one truth had crystallized: the Midnight Rescue would not simply determine the fate of a single institution, it would determine whether Spain woke to a functioning financial system at all. The decisive moment approached. And the margin for error had vanished. Dawn broke over Madrid, but the city woke to a reality reshaped in darkness. Before the markets opened, the government executed its plan with precision. Police secured the bank's headquarters. Regulators entered with sealed directives. Senior executives were escorted to private rooms for questioning. And in a statement timed to precede the first trades of the morning, Spain announced the extraordinary measure the night had demanded: the bank had been taken under state control. The announcement rippled through the financial world in an instant. Screens across trading floors lit up with frantic movement. Some investors braced for collapse. Others breathed relief that Spain had acted decisively. At home, ordinary citizens listened to the news with a mix of fear and gratitude. Fear, because a pillar of their financial system had failed. Gratitude, because the failure had been contained before it could devour everything around it. Inside the government's crisis center, no one celebrated. Exhaustion clung to every face. They knew the intervention had prevented a disaster, but they also knew what came next: a long, painful process of exposing what had gone wrong and rebuilding what had been lost. Teams were dispatched to assess the bank's real condition. The findings were worse than expected. Mispriced assets. Hidden losses. Contracts written on hopes rather than numbers. Years of risk had been allowed to accumulate unchecked, waiting for a single spark to ignite it. Markets stabilized slowly. Not because the crisis was over, but because Spain had shown it would not let the system collapse. Other banks released statements confirming their liquidity. The central bank provided additional lines of credit. Europe watched closely but did not panic. The decisive action, though costly, had restored a fragile but vital sense of control. As investigations unfolded, stories emerged of warnings dismissed, of oversight bypassed, of growth pursued with more ambition than caution. The narrative was painfully familiar: institutions built to protect prosperity had been compromised by the very optimism that once propelled them forward. Spain, like so many nations before it, confronted the uncomfortable truth that stability must be guarded not only by policy, but by discipline. Reforms followed. Lending standards tightened. Audits deepened. Regulations sharpened. The rescued bank was restructured, its leadership replaced, its operations scrutinized line by line. Spain vowed that such a crisis would not be allowed to unfold again under the cover of late-night shadows. But the memory of that midnight, the calls, the collapse, the race against time, left a lasting mark on the nation's financial identity. It revealed how quickly confidence can erode, how silently risk can grow, and how essential decisive action becomes when the system teeters on the brink. Madrid survived its reckoning. But the lesson lingers, whispered in boardrooms and echoed in economic forums: the strength of a financial system is measured not by how brightly it shines in prosperity, but by how swiftly it acts in crisis. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.